Jack-o'-lanterns and cobwebs. It was a crisp autumn evening when Emma arrived at the Petersons' house to babysit their 2 children, Sophie and Jack. The Petersons were heading to a Halloween party and had assured Emma they would be back by midnight. The house was decorated with jack-o'-lanterns and cobwebs, adding a festive yet eerie touch to the night. After the children were tucked into bed, Emma settled onto the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a horror movie queued up on the TV. She loved the thrill of scary movies, and tonight seemed like the perfect night for one. She dimmed the lights and pressed play, letting herself be drawn into the suspenseful plot. An hour into the movie, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Emma jumped, her heart racing. She paused the movie and listened, but the house was silent again. Telling herself it was just the cat or maybe a breeze knocking something over, she reluctantly got up to investigate. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the window. Emma flipped the switch, flooding the room with harsh light. The back door was ajar, swaying slightly. A chill ran down her spine. She could have sworn she locked it earlier. Cautiously, she approached the door and peered outside. The backyard was empty, bathed in shadows. She quickly shut and locked the door, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping over her. She turned to head back to the living room when she saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, wearing a grotesque mask and holding a machete. Emma's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was frozen in place, staring at the masked figure. Then instinct kicked in. She turned and ran, sprinting up the stairs to the children's room. She had to protect Sophie and Jack. She burst into their room, slamming the door shut behind her and locking it. Sophie and Jack sat up in bed, eyes wide with fear. "Emma, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "There's someone in the house," Emma whispered, trying to keep calm. "We need to stay quiet and hide." She ushered them into the closet, pulling the door shut, just as heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. The sound sent a wave of terror through her. She held the children close, listening to the slow, deliberate steps getting closer and closer. The footsteps stopped outside the bedroom door. There was a moment of silence, then a loud bang as the door was kicked open. Emma clapped a hand over Sophie's mouth, stifling her scream. Through the slats of the closet door, she saw the masked killer enter the room, the machete glinting in the dim light. The killer moved slowly, methodically, searching the room. Emma's heart pounded so loudly, she was sure it would give them away. She tightened her grip on the children, willing them to stay silent. The killer's footsteps approached the closet, and Emma felt a surge of panic. The closet door was yanked open, and the killer's mask loomed above them. Emma acted on instinct, grabbing a coat hanger and jabbing it at the killer's face. He staggered back, giving her a moment to act. She shoved Sophie and Jack towards the door, screaming at them to run. They darted out of the room, Emma right behind them. The killer recovered quickly, chasing after them with a growl of rage. Emma raced down the stairs, the children ahead of her, and headed for the front door. She could hear the killer's footsteps pounding behind her, getting closer. She threw open the door, practically pushing the children outside. They ran across the lawn, screaming for help. Emma turned to see the killer at the bottom of the stairs, machete raised. She didn't wait to see what he would do next. She sprinted after the children, adrenaline driving her forward. They reached the neighbour's house, banging on the door and shouting for help. The door opened to reveal Mr. Johnson, looking startled and alarmed. Emma quickly explained what was happening, and he ushered them inside, locking the door and calling the police. Within minutes, sirens wailed, and the police arrived, surrounding the Petersons' house. Emma clutched the children, trying to soothe their sobs, while her own heart continued to race. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but the killer was gone, leaving only the eerie memory of his masked face and the terror of the night. Emma knew she would never forget the sight of that machete, or the feeling of utter helplessness as she fought to protect Sophie and Jack. The Petersons returned home to find their children safe but deeply shaken, and Emma vowed never to babysit again. The Night of Shadows. The Millers lived in a grand old house at the edge of town, a sprawling Victorian mansion with creaky floorboards and dark, winding hallways. It was the kind of house that seemed alive, with a personality shaped by decades of memories and secrets. This was where Emily, a 17-year-old high school student, found herself one Friday night babysitting for the Millers' 2 children, Timmy and Sarah. Mrs. Miller had given Emily the usual rundown. Dinner was in the fridge, the kids' bedtime was at 8, and they'd be back by midnight. As the Millers drove away, the house seemed to grow quieter, the ambient noises of a lived-in home fading into an eerie silence. The evening started normally enough. Emily cooked dinner, played board games with the kids, and read them a story before tucking them into bed. By 9 o'clock, the house was still, and Emily settled on the couch with a book. She had just started reading when she heard a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from upstairs. Thinking it was the kids, she went to check on them. Timmy and Sarah were sound asleep, their breathing deep and even. The thumping continued, though, seeming to come from the attic. Emily hesitated but decided to investigate. She climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step creaking under her weight. At the top, she found a single door, slightly ajar. She pushed it open and peered into the darkness. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and thick cobwebs. She saw nothing that could be making the noise and, feeling uneasy, decided to head back downstairs. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs, the sense of being watched growing stronger with each step. Back in the living room, Emily tried to shake off the feeling of unease. She checked her phone, hoping for a distraction, but there was no signal. Frustrated, she returned to her book, but the words swam on the page, and she couldn't focus. The house seemed to be pressing in on her, the shadows growing longer and darker. Another hour passed, and just as Emily started to relax, the thumping resumed, louder and more insistent this time. It was followed by a soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. Emily's pulse quickened. She grabbed a flashlight and decided to check on the kids again, trying to convince herself it was nothing. As she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed Timmy's door was open. She walked in, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Timmy was not in his bed. Panic set in as she hurried to Sarah's room. Sarah was also gone. Emily's mind raced. She had just seen them asleep not long ago. Where could they have gone? She heard the dragging sound again, coming from the attic. Gathering her courage, she headed back up the attic stairs. The attic door was now fully open, revealing a scene that made her blood run cold. Timmy and Sarah stood in the centre of the room, their eyes wide and unblinking, facing a dark figure crouched in the corner. The figure slowly turned to look at her, its face hidden in the shadows, eyes glowing with a sinister light. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stood up, towering over the children. It reached out a long, bony hand towards Emily, its fingers unnaturally long and clawed. Timmy and Sarah turned in unison, their movements stiff and unnatural, like marionettes on strings. Emily's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows around the room. She took a step back, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure took a step forward, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Suddenly, the attic light blazed to life. Emily turned to see Mr. and Mrs. Miller standing in the doorway, their faces pale and stricken. Mrs. Miller rushed forward, grabbing the children and pulling them away from the figure. Mr. Miller stood between Emily and the entity, chanting something under his breath. The figure recoiled, letting out a guttural hiss. The room seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy as Mr. Miller continued his chant. Slowly, the figure began to fade, the glow in its eyes dimming until it vanished completely. The attic fell silent. Emily stood there, trembling, as Mrs. Miller held the children close. Mr. Miller turned to her, his face a mix of relief and sorrow. "I'm so sorry you had to experience that," he said. "We hoped it wouldn't return, but it seems we were wrong." "What was that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "A spirit," Mrs. Miller explained. "This house, it has a history. We've tried to cleanse it, but sometimes it comes back. It feeds on fear." Emily nodded numbly. the events of the night crashing down on her. She felt a wave of exhaustion and sat down on the top step, trying to process what had just happened. The Millers escorted her downstairs, and as she left the house, she glanced back at the attic window. For a moment she thought she saw a shadow move, but then it was gone. She didn't look back again.